I'm going to start with cutting out the fabric. So your fabric has a right side, which is the colorful, and a wrong side, which is generally more muted. If your fabric is a solid, it can be a little more difficult to tell. Your fabric also has a selvage that runs lengthwise down the fabric, and then it'll have a factory or cut edge. That's the factory edge, and then this is the cut edge. This one I had serged before I washed it so it didn't ravel. So you're going to lay it out, fold your selvages to match, smooth it out as best you can, and then I like to fold it one more time so that it fits nicely on my board. Right, so now my fabric is folded, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scoot it over so that the entire cut edge is lined up along. I'm just going to use the 30 because I'm cutting a 15-inch strip. Hey bud, please don't bump it. Alright, so remember you've got 4 layers of fabric here, so sometimes part of your layers will be shorter. So just make sure you can cut a nice clean edge all the way along your fabric. So I'm going to trim that off at 30, and then I'm going to cut it again at 15, and that will give me a 15-inch strip to cut my 7.5-inch by 15-inch rectangles from. Alright, so now I've got my 15-inch strip, and I'm going to cut my 7.5-inch rectangles out of this. So again, I'm going to line it up. We want to cut off the selvage edges because they are wound, or they're woven a little more tightly, and they can pull, distort your fabric. So I'm going to line it up along my 30 again, and just trim those off. And then since I want 7.5-inch strips, I'm going to cut it at 22.5. Let me see. The end of this ruler broke off, so it's kind of annoying. There's my 1/2 inch. Alright, so there's one rectangle we can work with, and I can figure out the rest of it later. Cut up the rest of it later. So this print is sort of directional. I guess it doesn't really matter, but if you want it to go vertically on the face of your mask, that might be something to pay attention to. So we're going to just work with one of these pieces. So the next step is to finish the short 7.5-inch ends. I'm going to use my serger to give them a nice finish so the ends don't unravel. Alright, so now I have those ends serged, and what I'm going to do is fold my fabric, the right sides facing each other, and match up those short ends, and just give it a little hand press for now is enough. Then the next step, so I'm going to take my ruler, I'm going to measure 1.5 inches in, and just make a little dot in my seam allowance. Repeat that on the second side. Just make a little dot 1.5 inches in from the end. Now I'm over at my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew from the edge of my fabric to that dot that I put in the seam allowance, and I'm going to reverse a few stitches on both ends of that seam. So I set my needle in, I'm going to go forward, reverse a little bit at this end, and then I'm going to snip my threads. Alright, so since my dot was on the wrong side of the fabric, I'm going to start from in the middle here so you can just see. So I'm going to set my needle. I'm going to go forward a few stitches, back a few stitches, stitch the end, and then also reverse on that end. And that'll just help lock that seam so it won't come unraveled as easily. And I'm using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I don't know if you can see, but there's a little 3 on my needle plate here. This is a vintage sewing machine, but that's 3/8 of an inch, and that gives you plenty to fold it over and make sure that your raw edges are inside the mask. So I'm going to hold on to my thread end, go a few stitches back, and then off the end of my fabric, and a few stitches back. And then that seam should not go anywhere. And again, I'm going to snip my thread ends. All right, so now the next step is to take this to my ironing board. And what we're going to do is open it up, lay it flat, and then we're going to press this seam open as though it continued all the way down the fabric. So this is going to be our pocket opening so that they can replace the filters. So I'm just going to press this open with my iron, and I will come back to the sewing machine. So the next step is to top stitch the bottom side of our pocket opening. So I brought my fabric to my sewing machine, and it's still right sides together with the wrong side out. I just find it a lot easier to sew this seam working from the inside of the tube. So I have it set up so the seam is just to the right side of my needle. So when I bring my needle down, it's about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. And that's about perfect for that top stitching. All right, so again, set my needle. I'm going to hold on to my threads so they don't pull back in. Take a stitch, back up, and then I'm just going to continue, and I'm just going to open this up as I go. I'm just going to stitch down, staying 1/8 of an inch away from that edge. So I'm just continuing to pull that back and making sure nothing gets folded under the needle. And then I'm going to reverse at this end. All right, so I'm going to pull that out from under my needle, and now I'm going to turn it right side out. Okay, so the next step is to fold it, leaving about 1/2 inch above the pocket. So since our seam allowance was 3/8 of an inch, I'm just giving it a generous fold, so it's like the seam allowance is in there plus a little bit of extra room, and that gives us about 1/2 an inch little pocket to put our twist tie in. So I'm just gonna hand press this for now, and then I'm gonna carry it over to my ironing board, give it a good press, because that just makes it easier to top stitch. All right, so the next step is to top stitch the top and bottom of our mask. The instructions said to top stitch all the way around it. I didn't find that to be necessary. I did a bunch of them yesterday. So I'm just going to top stitch 1/8 of an inch in on the top of the mask and the bottom of the mask, and that just keeps it in shape when it gets laundered. So I'm going to set my needle, same routine, back stitch, then we're going to go forward. Sorry, my foot pedal got all crooked. Turn around and repeat that step on the bottom of the mask. I caught some stray serger threads, but that's all right, they'll pull loose. I'm gonna snip my threads here. All right, so now we have a teeny weeny pocket at the top of the mask. We have a big pocket at the bottom of the mask. So you're going to take your plastic coated twist tie or a pipe cleaner. You're going to insert it into the pocket. Mine are actually about 8 inches long, or maybe 7 and 3/4, something like that. They're just a little bit long. So that just gives me an edge to make sure that they're all the way up in the mask. And then I just fold them out of the way later or trim them. All right, so I've got my twist tie inserted. I've made sure that it's tucked all the way up into the top of that seam. And now I'm going to top stitch the top side of my pocket. Again, 1/8 of an inch from the edge. This time the opening is to the left of my needle. So as you can see here, my twist ties are just a smidge too long. What I've been doing is just tucking them in and giving them a little fold, and that just kind of keeps them out of the way, keeps them in place. All right, so now my mask is stitched top and bottom, my pocket is secured, and my twist tie is inside. So now it's time to form the pleats. My ironing board is in another room, so it's kind of a pain. But what we're going to do, I have my mask laid down so it's right side up. My nose piece with the twist tie is at the top of the mask. We want our pleats to face down on the front of the mask. So I'm going to start from the bottom, and I'm just going to go about 1.5 inches up and fold like a finger width pleat. These don't have to be exact, but they should be like 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch deep. So just a good finger depth. All right, so I'm just going to hold that in place with my pinkies and fold another pleat that just, if you look from the side here, my pleats just ever so slightly meet up and overlap there. And then I'm going to do one more pleat. And again, they're about an 1.5 inches apart and 3/4 inch deep. So I've got all 3 of my pleats folded, and I'm just going to bring my iron and give them a pretty good solid press and a decent amount of steam, because we really want those to hold as we move to the sewing machine. All right, and if you let your fabric cool for even just a few seconds before you pick it up, it seems like the pleats hold a little better. All right, one last step before we attach the bias tape. You want to baste down your pleats so they don't go anywhere. So since this is just for basting, you can go ahead and switch your machine to a longer stitch if you would like. I moved mine all the way up. And you don't need to secure your ends. This is just to hold it into place while you attach your bias tape. And if you sew so the pleats are facing down, it's a lot easier to keep them from scooting around on you. So this one I'm going to turn and stitch from the left side. And I'm just skipping my twist tie channel because it's a little bulkier and not necessary at this point. So the hospital has decided that tie masks are maybe a little easier to adjust, so I'm going to cut some ties for this mask. I can do another one later with the elastic if anybody wants a tutorial for that, but I think the video shows that one pretty well. So it's hard to get this all in frame, but I'm just going to trim off my selvage edge. So this is the length of the fabric. So this was 1 yard of fabric, so the length of it is 36 inches, which is the right length for the ties. So I'm just going to use my ruler to measure in 2 inches. So I've got my fabric edge is along the 2-inch line here, and I'm just going to cut along my ruler. So I've got one 2-inch by 36-inch strip, and now I'm going to cut my second, and actually on this fabric it looks like the window panes are just about 2 inches. So that's handy. Alright, so there are my 2 biased strips. I'm going to bring them over to my iron and prep them to sew onto the mask. So there are a couple different ways to do the bias tape if you're not using pre-made bias tape, but they all start with preparing your fabric by folding your edges to meet in the middle. Just give that a good press, and that'll give us somewhere to start from. Alright, so one tutorial, there's a link on the Facebook page, but basically, oh, my pins aren't long enough for this one. Basically, you take a pin and you put it through your ironing board cover. You leave an inch space for your bias tape to slide through, and you put a pin on the other side, and so that you have the width of your iron. And then you just iron between them, and you pull it, and you do each section at a time. Mine is too narrow for that. So you can totally do this by hand. I have this bias tape folder. I don't love it, but it's better than nothing. So I have burned my hands doing this thing a few times. Basically, I'm just going to secure the end of my fabric to my board, and then I'm just going to kind of press it as it comes out. So this just kind of introduces the fold, and then you just press it and press it. It's not great, but you know, better than doing it all by hand. So I'm just going to continue to pull this down the length of my fabric, press my edges to meet in the middle, and again, since you're working with cotton, yeah, it's the steam that'll burn you. Since you're working with cotton, you probably want to use a good deal of steam. It just helps to set the fibers where you want them to be. So there is one piece of bias tape prepped. So my seams are folded to meet in the middle. This was a 2-inch wide strip, so then we folded it into the middle, so then now it's a 1-inch wide strip. We will stitch it on and then fold it again around the edges of our mask, and that will make it a 1/2-inch wide bias tape. So you can also buy a packaged 1/2-inch wide bias tape, or maybe you have some packages at home, but since many stores are closed, this might be a better way to go about it right now. So I'm going to do my other strip, and then I will show you how to sew them on. Alright, so now I'm going to prepare to put my bias tape on my mask. They found it works best to have about 12 inches below the mask and the rest of it above the mask. So I'm going to take my mask laid along my ruler. I'm going to measure 12 inches up from the bottom, and I'm just going to put a little dot there. And that way, when I lay it out, actually I want to put the dot on the inside. Alright, so this way when I lay it out along my fabric, I know where to line it up on the bottom of the mask. So there's my dot. I'm going to bring it over here to my mask, and I'm going to match that 12-inch mark with the bottom of the mask. And grab some clips for this part. Alright, so now I have it lined up so I have 12 inches below my mask from this dot down, and that gives them space to tie behind the neck. And then 3.5 inches up the top of my mask, and the rest of the length is above the mask. So I have my mask lined up on my machine, and I'm going to stitch again with a 3/8 inch seam allowance from the top of my mask down to the bottom of my mask, and I'm going to secure those stitches on each end. Make sure you're into the mask when you reverse, and that will just help keep it from going anywhere. You can use pins or clips. I like clips because they're faster, but if you don't have any, Amazon certainly isn't going to get them to you in any reasonable amount of time right now, so use what you've got. Clothespins also work. Okay, so here you can see where I stitched my bias tape in place. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold along that stitch line. So my bias tape is out from my mask, and then I'm going to fold it again so that my folded edge covers up those stitches. So my bias tape wraps completely around the end of the mask, completely encasing all those raw edges, and my folded edges meet. So I'm going to secure that. Sorry about my children. And I'm going to actually continue that fold all the way down the length of my bias tape. So this is where those folds that we ironed during the setups come in handy. So if you haven't finished your edges, somehow at this point you would want to tuck them in slightly. My edges are serged and I'm not terribly worried about them unraveling. I might put a drop of fray check or something on them as well. But we're going to set it up so we're stitching in about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. I'm going to get that set. And then reverse a few stitches to lock I might want a slightly beefier needle for this step, but I think we're okay. All right, so I'm just going to stitch the entire 36-inch length of my bias tape to make those ties. You might want to clip this. I am lazy and have bad habits. So again, as we work through the mask, we're staying 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the bias tape and just continuing to stitch that in place. All right, and now I will continue down the longer length, which is about... Okay, so now my mask of the bias tape is nicely finished, front and back, and it's stitched all the way down the length, so this mask can be tied in place. I have 12 inches below the mask, the rest of the fabric is above the mask, and I will just repeat that step on the other side, and then it's finished. It has a pocket on the back side that they can stick filtration in. It has a twist tie in the nose, so it can be adjusted to fit safely on many different sizes of faces, and then the pleats expand. So, happy sewing, and thank you for all of the help that you're giving to our community.